Let me ask you something strange. Have you ever walked past a locked door and felt an almost physical pull toward it? Not because you needed what was inside, not because anyone told you it was important, but simply because it was locked. That feeling, that irrational, almost magnetic pull toward what is forbidden or hidden, is one of the most deeply wired impulses in the human brain. And for the last 70 years, one single location on Earth has exploited that impulse more effectively than perhaps any other place in history. But here's what I want you to understand before we go any further. This video is not about aliens. I know, that might disappoint some of you, but stay with me, because what I'm going to show you is something far more interesting than little green men in underground hangars. What I'm going to show you is how secrecy itself becomes a weapon, how the human mind responds to hidden information in ways that are predictable, powerful, and sometimes dangerous, how governments have used silence as a tool of control, and how an empty patch of Nevada desert became one of the most psychologically potent locations on the planet, not because of what's inside it, but because of what it does to the people on the outside. We're going to travel through history, through neuroscience, through Cold War strategy, through modern conspiracy culture, and through the very architecture of how human beings process the unknown. By the end of this video, you will understand not just why Area 51 became a legend, you will understand why you would have believed the same things, made the same assumptions, and felt the same pull. Because the story of Area 51 is ultimately a story about the human mind, and that story begins much earlier than most people think. To understand why places like Area 51 become mythological, you first have to understand what secrecy actually does to a human brain. Psychologists have studied this for decades, and the findings are consistently fascinating. When a person is told that something exists but is denied access to it, a very specific cognitive process begins. The brain doesn't simply file that information away and move on. Instead, it enters a kind of low-level active search mode. It starts pattern matching. It starts connecting unrelated pieces of information and testing whether they might explain the hidden thing. It generates hypotheses automatically without any conscious instruction. This is sometimes called the information gap theory, developed by a researcher named George Lowenstein in the 1990s. His argument was simple but profound. Curiosity isn't driven by a desire to know everything. It's specifically activated by the awareness of a gap, by the recognition that something exists which you do not yet understand. And crucially, the more you are told that the gap exists while being denied the means to close it, the more intensely the curiosity burns. Area 51 is in this sense a perfect laboratory experiment in applied psychology, because for decades the government did something that seems almost counterproductive from a secrecy standpoint. It didn't completely deny that something was out there. It allowed the location to be partially visible. It restricted access without eliminating awareness. It placed warning signs, it had guards, and all of that created exactly the conditions Lowenstein described, a visible gap that could not be closed. Now let's layer onto this something from an even older tradition of human psychology. Across virtually every culture in human history, there exists a category of knowledge described as forbidden or sacred. From the oracle at Delphi to the inner chambers of Egyptian temples to the sealed vaults of medieval alchemists, every civilization has constructed a category of hidden knowledge and assigned it extraordinary significance. Anthropologists call this the logic of the sacred secret, and it operates on a consistent psychological principle. The act of concealment itself communicates value. We instinctively assume that what is hidden must be worth hiding. This is why the government's silence about Area 51, which was intended to protect classified aircraft development, had the opposite effect on public perception. Instead of communicating that nothing significant was happening, it communicated, through the sheer theatrics of restriction, that something enormously significant was happening. And this brings us to one of the most important principles in the psychology of secrecy, which is that secrecy is never truly neutral. Every act of concealment sends a signal, and the signal is almost always interpreted as confirmation of importance. Consider how this played out in the Cold War context specifically. The 1950s were a period of extraordinary anxiety for the American public. The Soviet Union had nuclear weapons, a global ideological war was underway, the government was actively encouraging citizens to prepare for the possibility of atomic attack. In that climate, the idea that secret and terrifying things were being developed by both sides was not paranoid, it was entirely rational. People weren't wrong to assume that something significant was happening in restricted military zones. Something significant was happening. The cognitive error, if we can call it that, was not in assuming that secrets existed. It was in the specific content people imagined to fill those secrets. And that content, the alien spacecraft, the reverse-engineered technology, the underground laboratories, that content tells us something fascinating about the specific fears and fantasies of the mid-20th century. Because the stories people tell to explain the unknown are never random. They are shaped by the cultural vocabulary available to the people telling them. And in the 1950s, that vocabulary was saturated with science fiction, with atomic anxiety, and with the dawning awareness that technology was advancing faster than human beings could emotionally process. To really understand how Area 51 became what it became, you need to spend some time inside the mind of an ordinary American in 1955. The world feels simultaneously more powerful and more fragile than it has ever felt before. Just 10 years ago, 2 atomic bombs ended a world war. Now, both the United States and the Soviet Union have weapons that could end civilization itself. The technology that humanity has developed in the last 20 years, radar, jet aircraft, rockets, nuclear fission, seems to have arrived almost too fast. It outpaces ordinary human understanding. Most people alive in 1955 cannot fully explain how any of these technologies work. They just know that they exist and that they are extraordinary. Now add to this a very specific piece of cultural context. In the years following World War II, science fiction experienced an enormous explosion in popularity. Stories about alien civilizations, about spacecraft, about contact with beings from other worlds, these were not fringe obsessions. They were mainstream entertainment. Magazines, radio programs, early television, cinema, all of them were saturated with the vocabulary of extraterrestrial possibility. And this vocabulary was doing something subtle but important. It was giving ordinary people a conceptual framework for imagining technology that exceeded their understanding. If something flies faster than anything you have ever seen and at altitudes that seem impossible, the science fiction framework gives you a ready-made explanation. It's not from here, it's from somewhere else. That explanation doesn't require technical knowledge. It doesn't require understanding aerodynamics or propulsion systems. It just requires accepting the premise that the impossible is possible, which science fiction had spent a decade normalizing. So when the U-2 spy plane began flying test missions over Nevada in the mid-1950s, the stage was perfectly set. Here was an aircraft that could operate at altitudes of 70,000 feet, nearly twice the ceiling of conventional aircraft at the time. When commercial airline pilots looked up and saw something moving at impossible altitude and speed, they were seeing something genuinely unprecedented in their experience. And they were seeing it in a cultural moment when the most available language for the genuinely unprecedented was extraterrestrial. The reports began coming in almost immediately. Commercial pilots, military personnel, civilians, all describing objects that moved in ways they couldn't explain. And here's the crucial detail that makes the whole story so rich. These people were not lying. They were not hallucinating. They were accurately describing what they saw. Their observations were real. Their interpretations were shaped by the tools available to them. The government knew exactly what those objects were. They were classified aircraft. But explaining that, even vaguely, would have compromised some of the most strategically important technology the United States possessed during one of the most dangerous periods in modern history. So they stayed silent. And their silence confirmed for the people making these reports that something was genuinely being hidden. This is the moment where the architecture of the Area 51 myth gets locked into place, because now you have all the essential components. You have a real and significant secret. You have government silence that is interpreted as confirmation of something even larger. You have a cultural framework that provides a specific and compelling explanation, alien technology, and you have an ongoing series of genuine, unexplained observations that continue to feed the narrative. What makes this particularly interesting from a psychological standpoint is the concept that researchers call confirmation bias. Once a belief is formed, the mind has a powerful tendency to notice and remember information that confirms that belief, while discounting or ignoring information that contradicts it. So once the extraterrestrial framework was established, every new unexplained sighting, every new government denial, every new piece of circumstantial connection between different events, all of it fed the belief. None of it weakened it. The denials themselves became evidence because in the conspiratorial framework, of course the government would deny it. That's what you do when you're hiding something. And this is where we need to acknowledge something important and uncomfortable. The conspiratorial reasoning isn't inherently irrational. In a world where governments do conceal significant information, and Area 51 proves definitively that they do, healthy skepticism towards official statements is not paranoia. It's a reasonable adaptive response to a real pattern of behavior. The problem is that healthy skepticism, when combined with a compelling alternative narrative and powerful confirmation bias, can become something much less healthy. It can become a closed loop where no evidence could ever disprove the belief, because any contradictory evidence is simply reinterpreted as part of the cover-up. Understanding that loop, how it forms, why it's so difficult to escape, and what it costs us is one of the most important things we can take from the story of Area 51.
Let's talk about what a conspiracy theory actually is, because the term gets used so loosely that it's lost most of its analytical precision. A conspiracy theory, in the technical sense used by researchers who study them, is not simply a theory about a conspiracy. Governments do conspire. Corporations do collude. Powerful people do make secret agreements that affect the rest of us. Those are real conspiracies, and theorizing about them is entirely legitimate. What makes something a conspiracy theory in the problematic sense is a specific set of structural features. It involves a hidden group of extraordinary power and malevolent intent. It provides an explanatory framework that is unfalsifiable, meaning no evidence could potentially disprove it. It reinterprets all contradictory evidence as part of the conspiracy itself, and it tends to expand over time, incorporating more and more unrelated events into the same overarching narrative. The Area 51 mythology hits all of these markers with remarkable precision, and understanding how that happened tells us something important about what makes conspiratorial thinking so seductive. The first element is what we might call the narrative completeness instinct. Human beings are story-making creatures. We are deeply uncomfortable with incomplete narratives. When a story lacks a clear explanation for significant events, our minds experience something close to anxiety, and we will reach for explanations, even improbable ones, to resolve that discomfort. The government crashed something in New Mexico. The government had a secret base in Nevada. The government refused to explain things clearly. The narrative almost completes itself. You can feel the pieces wanting to connect. The second element is social transmission. Stories that trigger strong emotional responses spread dramatically more effectively than neutral information. Fear, wonder, outrage, and excitement are all powerful engines of transmission. The alien technology narrative triggers all four simultaneously. It's frightening. These are unknown beings with unknown intentions. It's wonderful. Imagine what we could learn from their technology. It's outrageous. The government is keeping this from us. And it's exciting. The universe is far more populated and interesting than we thought. A story that activates that many emotional channels simultaneously is almost impossible to stop spreading. The fifth element is the authority vacuum. Conspiracy theories thrive in spaces where official explanations are absent, delayed, or contradictory. When the U.S. military issued confusing and shifting statements about the Roswell incident in 1947, they did something worse than lying. They created an authority vacuum, a space where no credible official explanation existed. And nature abhors a vacuum. Alternative explanations rushed in immediately, and by the time more coherent official accounts emerged, the alternative narrative had already put down deep roots. The case of Bob Lazar illustrates a fourth element beautifully. When Lazar went public in 1989, claiming to have worked on reverse-engineered alien spacecraft, he gave the mythology something it had previously lacked: a specific, detailed, first-person account. And detail is enormously powerful in building belief. Psychologists have shown repeatedly that specific, vivid, detailed accounts are rated as far more credible than vague general claims, regardless of their actual accuracy. When Lazar described specific element numbers and specific propulsion mechanisms and specific facility layouts, he was activating the part of the human brain that associates specificity with truth. The details felt like they couldn't be invented. They felt like the kind of thing you would only know if you had actually been there. This is one of the most important things to understand about how belief works. The feeling of truth, the subjective sense that something is credible, is not reliably correlated with actual accuracy. Our brains did not evolve in an environment where we needed to reliably distinguish between authentic, detailed accounts and skillfully fabricated ones. We evolved in environments where most of the detailed accounts we heard were from people who had genuinely experienced the things they described. The machinery for processing narrative detail was never designed for a world of mass media, sophisticated storytelling, and motivated deception. There's a fifth element worth examining, which is the role of community and identity. Believing in the Area 51 extraterrestrial narrative isn't just an individual cognitive event, it's a social one. It connects you to a community of people who share that belief. It gives you a sense of access to hidden knowledge that most people lack. It positions you as someone who asks questions rather than accepting official narratives uncritically. All of these are socially and psychologically rewarding. The belief isn't just an explanation for a mystery, it's a social identity. And that makes it extraordinarily resistant to change, because abandoning the belief means abandoning the identity and the community that comes with it.
Now let's have a conversation that I think is more important than any discussion of alien spacecraft. Governments hide things. This is not a conspiracy theory. It's a documented, acknowledged, continuously occurring fact of political life. The question that matters is not whether concealment happens, but what kind of concealment happens, why it happens, and what the consequences of that concealment are for the people it affects. The history of classified government programs in the United States alone offers a genuinely astonishing catalog.
the Manhattan Project, MK Ultra, Operation Paperclip, COINTELPRO, the Tuskegee experiments, the Gulf of Tonkin deception, mass surveillance programs revealed by Edward Snowden. In case after case, programs that would have provoked enormous public opposition were concealed from the citizens they affected, sometimes for decades. In case after case, official denials were issued that turned out to be false. In case after case, the truth emerged only through leaks, investigative journalism, or eventual declassification. This history creates a genuinely difficult epistemic problem for citizens trying to evaluate government claims. Because the baseline, the actual historical record of government honesty about classified activities, is not reassuring. Governments have lied. They have concealed things that citizens deserved to know. They have issued categorical denials that turned out to be categorical lies. To simply trust official statements without question, given this history, is not a mark of rationality. It is a mark of naivety. But here's the tension. Acknowledging that governments lie about some things does not mean that governments lie about everything. Acknowledging that classified programs exist does not mean that every claimed classified program exists. The history of genuine government deception is real, but it cannot function as a license for believing any alternative claim regardless of evidence. Because the world in which every government denial is a lie is a world in which you can believe absolutely anything, which is a world in which truth has ceased to function as a meaningful category. The genuinely rational response to a history of government deception is not unlimited credulity toward alternative claims. It is a calibrated skepticism that demands evidence from all directions. It asks governments to provide verifiable evidence for their claims. It also asks alternative theorists to provide verifiable evidence for their claims. It treats the absence of disproof as genuinely insufficient grounds for belief, and it maintains the uncomfortable but essential position that uncertainty, real unresolved uncertainty, is sometimes the only honest place to stand. What the Area 51 story has done to public discourse, in a way that I think we should genuinely mourn, is that it has collapsed this nuanced position into a binary. Either you trust the government completely or you believe in alien cover-ups. Either you are naively credulous or you are a tinfoil hat conspiracy theorist. The complexity, the legitimate, important, historically grounded complexity of trying to evaluate government claims in a world where governments have a documented history of deception, gets lost in that binary. And that loss is costly, because the things governments are actually hiding, the surveillance programs, the military interventions, the corporate partnerships, the policy decisions made without public knowledge or consent, those things matter enormously. They affect real people in real ways. And when the discourse around government secrecy becomes dominated by alien spacecraft, the genuinely important questions get crowded out. This is perhaps the most politically significant legacy of the Area 51 mythology. Not the distraction itself, but the way it has shaped the cultural grammar available for discussing government secrecy. It has made it easier to dismiss serious questions about classified activities by associating them with the absurd. And that association, which is entirely unfair but psychologically powerful, serves the interests of people who would prefer that certain questions not be asked too seriously.
Step back for a moment from governments and classified programs and Cold War aircraft and conspiratorial reasoning, and consider something more intimate. Why do we find this story so compelling, not as a sociological question about populations and mass psychology, but as a personal question? What is it about the idea of hidden knowledge, of something just beyond our reach, protected by walls we cannot cross, guarded by silence we cannot break, that generates such extraordinary fascination? I think the answer has to do with something fundamental about the human condition. We are creatures who exist in the present moment but are aware of vast dimensions of reality that we cannot directly access.
We cannot see into the past. We cannot see into the future. We cannot access other people's minds. We cannot verify most of what we believe about the world through direct personal experience. We live, necessarily, in a state of profound epistemic incompleteness. We know a tiny fraction of what exists. We understand an even tinier fraction of what we know. Most of the time, we manage this situation through an elaborate set of cognitive shortcuts and trust relationships. We trust experts. We trust institutions. We trust established bodies of knowledge. These trust relationships are functional. They allow us to navigate the world without being paralyzed by the enormity of what we don't know. But they come at a cost. They require us to accept our own smallness, to acknowledge that we are not in possession of the deep truths about reality, to accept dependence on authorities whose judgment we cannot fully verify. Area 51 offers something seductive as an alternative to that acceptance. It offers the fantasy of hidden completeness, the idea that somewhere, someone knows the full story, that the universe is not genuinely mysterious, but merely concealed, that if you could just get past those guards, through those gates, into those facilities, you would find not more questions, but final answers. This fantasy is deeply comforting because the alternative, that reality is genuinely complex, that many important questions don't have clear answers, that uncertainty is not a temporary condition awaiting the revelation of hidden truth, but a permanent feature of existence, is genuinely difficult to live with. The conspiracy theory, for all its problems, at least offers a complete narrative. It might be a frightening narrative, but it's a complete one. And completeness, in a world of radical uncertainty, has an almost irresistible appeal. What's worth sitting with, really sitting with, is the possibility that the most honest and ultimately most productive response to the genuinely unknown is not to reach for a complete narrative that feels satisfying, but to maintain that uncomfortable space of not knowing, to stay curious without collapsing the mystery into a conclusion, to ask questions without demanding the kind of answers that foreclose further questions. The great scientists, the great philosophers, the great explorers of both the physical world and the world of ideas, almost without exception, they describe a relationship with the unknown that is not anxious but genuinely delighted. The unknown is not a threat to be managed or a gap to be filled. It is an invitation. It is the space where discovery becomes possible. It is, in the deepest sense, the only place where anything genuinely new can ever be found.
So let's come back to the Nevada desert one last time. Behind those gates and warning signs and restricted airspace, there is certainly something. There are almost certainly things we don't know. There are probably technologies being tested that would seem remarkable to us if we could see them. The history of that location is a history of genuine, extraordinary human achievement. Aircraft that redefined what was possible. Engineering that pushed the boundaries of what materials and physics would allow. Technical innovation that shaped the entire subsequent history of military aviation. That story, the real story, is genuinely impressive. Perhaps more impressive, in its own way, than the alien alternative, because it's a story about what human beings can do when they bring their full intelligence and creativity to bear on a problem, when they push past assumed limits, when they ask what's possible instead of accepting what's comfortable. But the most interesting mystery isn't inside those gates at all. The most interesting mystery is the one we've been exploring this entire time. Why do we need there to be something hidden? What is the emotional function of believing that the full truth is always just out of reach? What does it cost us to live in the information gap, to stay perpetually in that state of activated curiosity that never quite reaches resolution? And perhaps most importantly, what would it mean to be genuinely at peace with not knowing?
to hold the unknown as an invitation rather than a threat, to let the gap remain open, not because we've given up on understanding, but because we've recognized that the open question is more honest and ultimately more productive than the false closure of a complete but unverifiable narrative. Area 51 has been many things over the years: a military installation, a classified program, a cultural phenomenon, a conspiracy theory, a joke, a pilgrimage destination. But in the end, it might be most valuable as a question, not the question of what's inside, but the question of what our 70-year obsession with what's inside reveals about how we handle the unknown, and whether we might, with some reflection, handle it better. Because the way we relate to mystery, whether we're driven to collapse it into a comfortable story or willing to sit in its genuine openness, says something important about who we are. And changing that relationship, even slightly, might be one of the most useful things we can do. The gates are still closed, the questions are still open, and maybe that's exactly where they should be.